are false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, for inwardly they are ravening wolves.
Welcome to episode 24 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are returning to the theme of childhood, only this time it's the kids, and not the adults, who are in peril. First up we have The Night of the Hunter from 1955, the only film directed by the actor Charles Laughton, and starring Robert Mitchum, Shelley and Lillian Gish. Then we'll be heading back to Mexico for the quite brilliant Tigers Are Not Afraid from 2017, written and directed by Issa Lopez, and starring Paolo, Lara, Juan Ramon Lopez, Hansel, Casillas, and Rodrigo Cortez. Both of this week's movies juxtapose fairytale imagery with the grim realities of murder, corruption, and crime, depicting their young protagonists as casualties of societal and financial collapse, the first through the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the second through the rise and reach of gang culture in Mexico. Along the way, we'll be discussing those very themes and exploring the career of writer Davis Grubb, the conditions that led to the Great Depression, the careers of Charles Laughton and Issa Lopez, and much, much more. But first, as always, I'd like to begin by mentioning the main references that I've used for researching this week's episode, all of which will, as usual, be listed in the show notes. When discussing The Night of the Hunter, I have relied fairly heavily on the book The Night of the Hunter by Simon Callow, which is published by BFI Film Classics. I've also referred to the Palgrave Handbook of the Southern Gothic, which is edited by Susan Castillo-Street and Charles L. Crow, and I've also referred to the American Film Institute page on the film, as well as Wikipedia pages for director Charles Laughton, writer Davis Grubb, the film itself, and also the Great Depression. And when discussing Tigers Are Not Afraid, I have referred to the director's commentary, the behind-the-scenes making of the feature, and a Q&A between director Issa Lopez and director Guillermo del Toro, and those can all be found on the Blu-ray release from Shudder. I've also referred to interviews with Issa Lopez on the websites filmcomment.com, InSessionFilm.com, DeepestDream.com, DreadCentral.com, and Ola.com. And this week we are going to get directly into our first movie, which is, of course, The Night of the Hunter. This was released in 1955, and was the only film ever directed by the actor Charles Laughton. It stars Robert Mitchum, Shelley Lillian Gish, and in the roles of the children, Billy Chapin and Sally Jane Bruce. The screenplay was written by James Agee, though with heavy and uncredited input from Charles Laughton, and was adapted from a novel of the same name that was written by Davis Grubb and published in 1953. Davis Grubb was born in 1919 in West Virginia and came from what we would call a comfortable background. His father was an architect, but unfortunately he passed away when Davis was only 8 years old. His mother, who is quite clearly a model for the character of Rachel, was known for helping children in need, and eventually moved into social work. She was quite clearly a very strong influence on his worldview, and also his perception of women's roles in society. He was quoted in an interview as saying, "Women held this country together during the pioneer days, and I think they held it together during the Depression. I don't think this country ever would have made it without women, when women linked hands and saved the country." Grubb went on to study painting and creative writing at the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, which would later become the home of Andy Warhol, and also, as we mentioned several episodes ago, the director George A. Romero. However, he was also colourblind, and this led to him moving away from the visual arts towards writing full-time. That being said, he never entirely abandoned this early passion and continued to sketch and illustrate, with some of his drawings later finding their way into his published works. In 1940, he moved to New York, where he worked as a writer for NBC Radio, while also submitting short stories to major magazines. One of these stories, albeit unpublished, was titled The Gentleman Friend, and was inspired by the activities of a real-life murderer, a man called Harry Powers, who in 1931 confessed to the killing of 2 women and 3 children in West Virginia. This story would become the foundation of Grubb's debut novel, The Night of the Hunter, with its narrative also shaped by the economic hardship of the Great Depression, and by the poverty that his mother had witnessed firsthand in her years as a social worker. Published in 1953, the book became a national bestseller and went on to be a finalist for the 1955 National Book Award. Following its publication, Grubb would go on to write 9 more novels, one of which was called Fool's Parade, and which would be made into a film in 1971 starring James Stewart, George Kennedy, and Kurt Russell. In addition to these novels, he also published short stories, some of which were adapted for television. In 1964, his rural revenge story, The Return of Verge Lycans, was adapted for the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, and a year later so was his Southern Gothic tale, Where the Woodbine Twineth, which, much like Night of the Hunter, features a river trip and a child's doll, though with far more of an emphasis on the supernatural. In 1971, Rod Serling's series Night Gallery adapted his story The Horsehair Trunk into an episode called The Last Laurel, which tells of a crippled athlete who tries to murder his unfaithful wife through astral projection. 1971 also saw the publication of The Barefoot Man, which was the last novel to appear in Grubb's lifetime. His final novel, Ancient Lights, was released posthumously in 1982, and this is a story in which the founders of an international electronic conspiracy position themselves to take over the world. So, quite clearly, a work of fiction there then. Davis Grubb died in 1980 in New York City, aged 61, following a long illness and a fatal heart attack. His obituary in the New York Times described his fiction as possessing many of the qualities of American folk music, and highlighted the pairing of horror with his keen eye for social realism and commentary. And perhaps nowhere is that social commentary more clearly seen than in his debut novel, The Night of the Hunter, a work that, as I mentioned earlier, was profoundly shaped by the Great Depression of the 1930s and by the moral and economic collapse that followed. Although many people see the stock market crash of October the 29th, 1929, which is known as Black Tuesday, as the beginning of the Great Depression, the seeds had already been sown throughout the 1920s. Technological innovation, including electrification, the creation of the production assembly line, radio, movies, home appliances, and cars, had driven output and consumer demand, while mass advertising and the introduction of installment buying options normalized consumer debt. Rapid credit growth and a mania for the stock market also added to the sense of instability. So, when the stock market crashed in 1929, it may have wiped out billions of dollars in wealth, but the foundations for the Depression had already been laid. The impact of Black Tuesday was catastrophic and felt the world over. Thousands of banks collapsed, wiping out people's savings overnight. With no money to buy goods, factories and farms were forced to lay off staff, and overproduction sent prices into freefall. International trade soon followed, shrinking dramatically as the US imposed high tariffs in an attempt to protect their own markets. But instead of stabilizing the economy, this strategy provoked retaliatory tariffs from other countries, turning what could have remained a recession into a global depression. In the United States, exports plummeted by more than 60%. Millions of families lost their homes and their farms, and makeshift shantytowns sprang up across the country. Family structures broke down, birth rates fell, and migration surged as people moved in search of employment. Meanwhile, in Britain, already weakened by World War I debt, the heavy industries of coal, steel, and shipbuilding were all hit particularly hard. By 1932, unemployment had exceeded 3 million, particularly in the north of England, Scotland and Wales. Welfare support started to be means-tested, which fueled public anger and also gave rise to protests and hunger marches. Elsewhere in Europe, the consequences were equally severe. Germany had relied heavily on American loans to repay war reparations and was devastated when that line of credit dried up after 1929. By 1932, unemployment there had reached nearly 30%, and as we all know, the resulting chaos opened the door to fascism. In 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power by promising jobs, order, and stability. And all across Europe, employers, landowners, and sections of the middle class saw the threat of communism and socialism gaining traction as people began to rage against wealth inequality. Alarmed by these developments, they started to form alliances with the far right, which offered a convenient means to crush unions and preserve their own interests. The fascists, in their turn, exploited the crisis further, scapegoating minorities, migrants, and political opponents, weaponizing fear to secure power, and framing democracy as weak and a failure. And so this was the landscape against which Davis Grubb set his debut novel, locating it in West Virginia, a region that had been hit especially hard by the Depression, with entire communities left destitute and struggling to survive. It's this environment that drives Ben Harper to robbery, something that he explains as he is arrested. Quote, "I robbed that bank because I got tired of seeing children roaming the woodlands without food, children roaming the highways in this depression, children sleeping in old abandoned car bodies and junk heaps, and I promised myself I'd never see the day when my young'uns would want." End quote. In this world, much like our second movie this week, children are the victims, abandoned and orphaned through crime and poverty, and left very much to fend for themselves, with only a fortunate few being saved by the intervention of someone like Rachel, who says, quote, "It's a hard world for little things." End quote. Shortly before the book was published, word reached Hollywood that it was ripe for film adaptation, and by Hollywood I mean a man called Paul Gregory, a producer who had been working with the actor Charles Laughton. Looking for a vehicle for Laughton to direct, Gregory gave him an advance copy, and the actor was immediately enraptured. This, he decided, would be the film with which he would make his movie directorial debut. Charles Laughton was born in July 1899 in Yorkshire, England, where his parents ran a hotel in the town of Scarborough. In the summer of 1917, at just 18 years old, he enlisted in the army, and then served during World War I, during which time both he and his battalion were gassed. Letters that he wrote home during this period already indicate an interest in acting, and although after the war he returned to work at the family hotel, he also soon began performing in amateur theatre productions. In 1925 he moved to London to study drama at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. Here he was taught by none other than the actor Claude Rains, who would later go on to star in the Universal horror movies The Invisible Man, The Wolfman and The Phantom of the Opera, as well, of course, as many others. Laughton made his professional stage debut the following year, in 1926, launching an extraordinarily successful stage career, both in London and later in the United States. In 1927, he appeared in a stage play alongside a young actress named Elsa Lanchester. As many of you will probably know, Lanchester herself went on to have an enormously successful stage and screen career, perhaps most famously as both Mary Shelley and the titular bride in The Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. They married in 1929 and would stay together until Laughton's death in 1962. His first film appearances also came through his partnership with Lanchester, when in 1928 they starred together in 3 short comedies that had been written especially for her by the writer H.G. Wells. In 1931, Laughton travelled to the States to make his New York stage debut and immediately caught the attention of Hollywood. This led to his first American role in James Whale's The Old Dark House in 1932, which we've spoken about several times now, and in which he co-starred with Boris Karloff. In this, he plays a blustering Yorkshire businessman stranded during a storm with his showgirl companion, and he immediately drew positive reviews, with the New York Times saying that he gave a splendid portrayal. And in fact, 1932 would turn out to be a very good year for him. He appeared in a total of 6 Hollywood films, and this included his performance as the mad scientist antagonist in the adaptation of H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau, which was called Island of Lost Souls. This also featured Bela Lugosi as one of the animal men created by Moreau's experiments, and was considered so shocking that it was rejected by 14 censor boards in the US and was banned altogether in the United Kingdom. And incidentally, this decision was probably quite a relief for the writer H.G. Wells, who considered the film to be a vulgar adaptation of his novel. So it's probably just as well that he never saw the 1977 or the 1996 versions. A year later, in 1933, Laughton portrayed the title role in The Private Life of Henry VIII, alongside his wife Elsa in the role of Anne of Cleves. And for this performance, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The success of that film prompted him to abandon the stage entirely and focus on his film career, something that he continued in both Britain and the United States. In 1935, he starred as Captain Bligh in the film adaptation of Mutiny on the Bounty, for which he received an Oscar nomination. And then, in 1937, he co-founded a production company called Mayflower Pictures, which produced 3 films featuring him in the lead. One of these was 1939's Jamaica Inn, the last film in Britain directed by Alfred Hitchcock before he left for Hollywood, and based on the novel by Daphne du Maurier. In the same year, Laughton also played the role of Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame for RKO Studios, an incredibly challenging role requiring him to spend 2.5 hours in the makeup chair every day, and for which he would gain further critical praise. During the 1940s, his screen career continued, though critics often commented on the inconsistency of his film choices. A reviewer for The Observer even said that, quote, "One of the most painful screen phenomena of the latter years has been the decline and fall of Charles Laughton." End quote. That being said, he appeared in some very good movies, including the 1947 courtroom drama The Paradigm Case, which paired him again with Alfred Hitchcock, and the 1948 film noir The Big Clock, opposite Ray Milland, as well as his wife Elsa Lanchester. Moving into the 1950s, he starred in the anthology movie O. Henry's Full House in 1952, and then the British comedy Hobson's Choice in 1954. Around this time, he also began to hold acting classes for young actors from his home in LA, sometimes with fellow Brit Charlie Chaplin, and he also returned to the stage, giving reading tours across America and introducing young audiences to works from Shakespeare, George Bernard Shaw, and others. This tour was both proposed and produced by Paul Gregory, a Broadway producer, and earned Laughton $200,000, which would be the equivalent of just over $2.5 million today. Quite clearly, this was an extremely profitable relationship, and Gregory went on to produce 5 stage plays with Laughton directing, including Don Juan in Hell in 1952 and the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial in 1954. So it would make sense, of course, that movies would be the next logical step. As I mentioned earlier, it was Gregory who gave Laughton the advance copy of Davis Grubb's novel, a book with which Laughton fell deeply in love, and which he decided that he would replicate as closely as possible on the big screen. And just before we continue, a very quick side note. There have been many myths about Charles Laughton and the work that he did on Night of the Hunter, and these include the rumours that he didn't actually direct the film himself, that most of it was directed by Robert Mitchum, that he hated working with the young children, and in fact he hated children full stop, and I'm sure that there are probably many more. And I have to say, in my research for this episode, I have found absolutely no truth to these rumours whatsoever. So if you're expecting some great reveal about how Laughton didn't direct this movie, I'm afraid you're going to be sorely disappointed. Once the film rights had been secured, Laughton and Gregory both agreed that they needed an experienced screenwriter, and the man that they hired for the job was James Agee. He was a journalist, poet and screenwriter, and had co-written the movie The African Queen with director John Huston. On paper then, he seemed a natural choice, even more so because he had written the text for a 1941 book called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. This was a photographic document of the lives of farmers during the Great Depression and was widely seen as one of the definitive texts covering the period. Aggie was hired for the figure of $30,000, which was a significant amount for the early 1950s and would be the equivalent of $360,000 today. However, although he was considered a high flyer, he was also, very sadly, an alcoholic, a disease that would see him drink himself into an early grave at the age of just 46. His condition, though, was hardly a secret in Hollywood, and both Laughton and Gregory would have known about it. But of course, in those days, addiction was far less understood than it is today, and the two probably thought that they would be able to keep their writer under control. Sadly, though, this would not be the case, and here is where we start to get very conflicting stories. According to James Aggie's biographer, his finished screenplay, quote, recreated a cinematic version of the novel in great detail, specifying use of news footage to document the story setting, and also adding any number of elaborate and impractical montages. End quote. Paul Gregory, however, had a very different story, claiming that Aggie drank excessively, lied compulsively, and was completely unmanageable. Gregory would go on to say that the writer eventually produced an unworkable 350-page screenplay that would have put the finished movie at a little under 6 hours. Something that Peter Jackson may have toyed with in the early 2000s perhaps, but this was, after all, 1955. Gregory continued that Laughton found the writer completely unprofessional and wouldn't go anywhere near him, which then caused Aggie to drink even more. According to Gregory, the relationship deteriorated to such an extent that Aggie was let go, and Laughton ended up writing the screenplay himself. To be fair to James Aggie and also Charles Laughton, it would appear that much of this testimony is rather biased on the part of Gregory. Following a later fallout with the director, it would appear that he wanted to go to great lengths to portray him as a monster who exacerbated Aggie's drinking problems and eventually took over the screenwriting job himself. Gregory's descriptions have certainly been contradicted by correspondence between both Laughton and Aggie, which indicates that their relationship remained cordial right up to the end. As for the screenplay itself, the first draft surfaced in 2004 and contained many scenes that could be found in the final movie, although admittedly it was indeed incredibly long, coming in at 293 pages instead of Gregory's reported 350. As for the myth that Aggie was fired from the production, again, it appears that this is not entirely accurate, and writers have suggested that his contract was in fact renewed and that Laughton directed him to cut the first draft of the screenplay in half, which he did. After this, however, it would appear that Laughton adapted it further, certainly editing it down, and this is something that the writer himself recognised and would prompt him to request that he not be given sole screenwriting credit. It's probably also worth noting that when Aggie died in May 1955, just 4 months after the release of the film, Laughton sent a telegram to his widow, which said, quote, "I've just heard the sad news of James's passing. I loved him." End quote. What we can infer, though, particularly given the almost documentary-style screenplay described by Aggie's biographer, is that the fairy tale approach to the movie came from Laughton himself. On completing the novel, he described it as a fairy story, a kind of nightmarish Mother Goose tale, and it's this aesthetic which lifts the film tonally and visually above the norm, and which has given it the longevity that it has. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so as always, if you have yet to see the movie, please approach with caution. Filmed in stark and high contrast black and white by cinematographer Stanley Cortez, Night of the Hunter borrows heavily from German Expressionism, and I know I make that point a lot in this series, but here it's pretty impossible to avoid it. Although the dusty town of the opening half of the movie is grounded in reality, particularly during the arrest of Ben Harper, As the film progresses, the visuals become increasingly unreal, with painted skylines, looming shadows, and glistening cobwebs, creating an almost dreamlike state, particularly during the children's journey down the river. Even the opening, which features the floating head of Rachel suspended in the heavens and surrounded by starlight and children, immediately signals that we're not really playing in the real world. And strange and somewhat dated as that moment might appear to the modern viewer, it clearly struck a chord with David Lynch, who echoes it in the closing moments of his 1980 movie The Elephant Man. As well as all of this, we have a use of light and shadow that wouldn't feel out of place in a silent era horror movie. Powell's menacing shadow on the wall of the children's room is pretty much straight out of Nosferatu, and the painterly sets that increasingly dominate the production really wouldn't feel out of place in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And I think this is particularly true in the bedroom scene, where Powell kills Willa Harper, and where the interior space has been distorted quite extensively to resemble a theatre or even a church. The sets were designed by art director Hilliard Brown, who had been an assistant art director on the movie Citizen Kane for Orson Welles, and he also provided art direction for The Creature from the Black Lagoon in 1954. And I think this is something that you can see in hindsight when you compare the underwater sequences of that movie with the horrifyingly beautiful scene of the dead Willa in her car underwater, hair floating behind her and fronds of seaweed gently rippling on either side of the frame. Brown designed these sets to emphasise the fairy tale theme that Laughton wanted to convey, saying that they were created from the position that only children see certain things, and that's something that's worth bearing in mind when we also discuss our second movie this week. This approach is certainly apparent when John and Pearl take a break from their journey to shelter for the night. The house and the barn they stop at loom disproportionately above them, suggesting a child's eye perspective. In fact, they could almost be drawings of buildings made by children themselves. Other striking moments in the film include the sequence of a huge black speeding train suggesting the doom that is heading towards the family, intercut with scenes of Willa being told that she needs a new man to give her life meaning. There's also a long shot of Powell on horseback in the distance as the children shelter in the barn, and another of Rachel waiting patiently in silhouette, shotgun in hand. It's an incredibly beautiful piece of filmmaking, and it's no wonder that Guillermo del Toro has called it a miracle of film and compared it to a remembered nightmare told by a child. Other directors have also taken inspiration from the film. The Coen brothers used the hymn Leaning on the Everlasting Arms in their 2010 remake of True Grit, and Joel Coen has also used the movie as a visual reference for his 2021 film The Tragedy of Macbeth. Spike Lee has also spoken on explicitly borrowing from Night of the Hunter for his 1989 movie Do the Right Thing. In that film, the character of Radio Raheem wears knuckle rings that say love and hate, and also has a speech that was inspired directly by this film's screenplay. And incidentally, the love and hate tattoos that Robert Mitchum has on his hands were not an invention of Davis Grubb, but were instead inspired by a real person. In his late 20s, Grubb had spent some time in Hollywood, saying that he used to drink in local taverns and would watch what he called night crawlers, the people who went around at night looking to appease their loneliness with drugs or sex or whatever came along. And one of these quote-unquote night crawlers was a man glimpsed momentarily in a bar with those very tattoos on his hands. The casting of Robert Mitchum as the psychopathic Harry Powell is inspired, though he was not in fact Laughton's first choice and was only approached for the role after Gary Cooper turned it down. By all accounts, the director approached him with the words, "Mitchum, I'm directing a film and there's a character in it who is a diabolical shit," to which Mitchum replied, "Present." By this stage, Mitchum, who was only 35 at the time, had a pretty colourful reputation in Hollywood. 4 years earlier, he had been arrested for possession of marijuana, and various criminal associations had come to light during the course of the trial, creating an incredibly dubious and dangerous persona in the eyes of the movie-going public. And this is something that he would play to great advantage, both in this movie and also as the criminal Max Cady in the 1962 thriller Cape Fear. He was incredibly enthusiastic about the role, and particularly about working with Charles Laughton, who he respected enormously. His performance in the movie is one of surprising contrasts, because whilst Harry Powell is indeed a monstrous psychopath, he is also shambling and pathetic, something that we see when he is threatened initially by Ben Harper in prison, and then by Rachel towards the end of the movie. This approach to the character was very much encouraged by Laughton, who wanted the actor to introduce a lighter and almost slapstick approach to the role. Davis Grubb was not particularly happy with this approach, and I have to say that I myself am not 100% convinced that it works, particularly towards the end of the movie when Rachel shoots him and he runs whooping and screaming into the night. That being said, his treatment of Willa on their wedding night, where he destroys her confidence, is spectacularly nasty and narcissistic, and one cannot help but feel regret when the lynch mob at the end of the movie don't manage to get their hands on him. And this, by the way, is very much inspired by the real-life case that I mentioned earlier, when post-trial, an angry mob formed in an attempt to lynch the killer Harry Powers, and the police had to smuggle him out of the back of the courthouse. The same, of course, happens here at the end of the film, and once again we see Powell not as the figure of menace we encountered earlier, seen through the eyes of the children, but rather a shambling figure who needs police protection. If nothing else, this film serves to remind us that killers are quite often not unstoppable monsters, but are most often pathetic and weak individuals who deserve not our fear, but rather our contempt. In casting the role of the doomed Willa Harper, Laughton selected a young actress who had been one of his regular students when he ran classes from his Hollywood home. Although Shelley Winters had already been Oscar nominated, the classes that she took with Laughton gave her an opportunity to really grow as an actress. And in her autobiography, she said, quote, "When the studios told me that I was a hunk of meat and a blonde bombshell, he made me understand that I was an artist and a human being, and I could demand respect and dignity." End quote. But while Laughton quite rightly had faith in her abilities, Robert Mitchum was a different prospect, and apparently remained sceptical about her performance throughout filming, though this didn't stop them from sharing one or two drinks together in between takes. Her journey from the strong woman who says she doesn't need a man to the cowed and hollowed shell who waits patiently for death is very well portrayed, particularly the flicker of realization that flashes across her face when she overhears Powell threatening her daughter. The role of Rachel Cooper, who sees through Powell's fake preacher act the moment she meets him, was played by Lillian Gish, an actress who first came to prominence during the silent era. She was deeply impressed by the script, calling it a very fine story of the battle between good and evil, and later went on to say that filming was an immensely enjoyable experience, recalling that the set was infused with purpose and harmony, and that everyone among the cast and the crew never had a moment's doubt about what they were making or the way that Charles Laughton was directing them, saying, quote, "We believed in and respected him totally." The character of Rachel acts as a counterpoint to both Powell's evil and Willa's weakness, displaying goodness through strength and a resilience that echoes Grubb's words about women getting the nation through the hard times. A formidable foe, she takes no prisoners whatsoever, and from the moment that the children arrive in her care, we have absolutely no doubt that they are in safe hands. Much like our second film this week, this is a movie that depends very much on the performances of the children, which is always a slightly worrying prospect given the nature and quality of some child casting decisions. That being said, both of them acquit themselves very well. Billy Chapin, who plays John, may have been 9 years old at the time, but he had already been on Broadway in the successful play 3 Wishes for Jamie. Sally Jane Bruce, who plays Pearl, was only 5 years old at the time, so unsurprisingly had no prior acting experience. She was selected after a nationwide search for child actors, and was chosen for her charm and unaffected delivery, but also because she could sing the hymn Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, which is used as a repeat motif throughout the film. This, however, would be her one and only acting role, and she would later go on to become a schoolteacher in California. Contrary to the myths that I mentioned earlier, Laughton had a very warm and successful relationship with the children, talking them through the emotions they were meant to experience and demonstrating the required actions himself. That being said though, there was one day at least where it didn't go quite so well. When giving Billy Chapin directions for the character, the 9-year-old raised an eyebrow and reminded the director that he had, after all, just won the New York Critics' Prize for his Broadway performance. Needless to say, Laughton was less than impressed with this level of arrogance and pretension coming from a 9-year-old and called for the actor to be taken out of his sight. And to be honest, I'm not sure I blame him. The shoot for The Night of the Hunter lasted just over 5 weeks, running from late August to early October 1954, and aside from a few external locations, it was largely filmed on the sound stages at United Artists Studios in Hollywood. As I've alluded throughout the discussion, the shoot was by all accounts an incredibly happy one, with the cast and crew all commenting on the positive environment that Laughton created. Unfortunately though, this spirit would not be carried through to the film's release. The Night of the Hunter previewed in May 1955 in Pasadena, California, and it's fair to say that the test audience reaction was not what anybody was hoping for. Viewers were very confused by the film's tone, and the slapstick elements that had been introduced really didn't help. The audience apparently laughed in all the wrong places, and also gave it extremely low ratings. Following this, popular mythology would have you believe that the film was slammed by the critics, but this is not entirely the case, though it's fair to say that most of them were rather bemused, and the reviews were rather mixed. The Los Angeles Examiner commented favourably on the nightmare feeling of helpless terror that Laughton produced, and the LA Times said approvingly that it was one of the year's most unusual pictures. Robert Mitchum's performance was also praised by the New York Herald Tribune, who said that it would surprise everybody watching, but overall, even the favourable reviews seemed confused about the film's tone. Other critics, though, were far less positive. The Washington DC News said that Robert Mitchum's performance was quote-unquote not right at all, and Variety suggested that the movie had far too many offbeat touches. Finally, the New York Film Daily said that Laughton's direction was overly dramatic and tended to the farcical, which, it said, carried over into the performances of both Shelley Winters and Robert Mitchum. All of this was compounded by an equally confused marketing campaign, which missold the film as something of an erotic thriller, leading to disappointment for audience members who were tempted in by the campaign. In fact, the marketing was so badly misjudged that producer Paul Gregory wrote to the studio and suggested that, as a result, they should change their name to United Against Artists instead. In what was very much a last-ditch effort, Gregory arranged for Shelley Winters and Robert Mitchum to appear on the massively popular Ed Sullivan Show, but as neither actor was used to live television, the appearance turned into something of a disaster. Technical problems meant that Mitchum was nearly inaudible, but this may have been just as well, as by all accounts he was also rather drunk. As you can imagine, none of this particularly helped with the film box office performance. Charles Laughton took the failure of the movie incredibly hard, as did Paul Gregory, and there is no doubt at all that it severely damaged their relationship. By the time of the film's release, Laughton had begun writing the screenplay of his second movie, which was an adaptation of Norman Mailer's World War II novel, The Naked and the Dead. However, when he turned in his finished screenplay, which was by all accounts as long as James Aggie's first draft of Hunter, the cost soon revealed itself to be completely unmanageable, and he and Gregory fell out irrevocably. As Gregory was the one with the film rights, when the two parted company, the project went with him. Laughton continued his reading tours under a new manager, and also returned to acting, having something of a triumphant return to cinema in 1957 with the release of Witness for the Prosecution. This was an adaptation of an Agatha Christie short story that was directed by Billy Wilder and co-starred Marlene Dietrich, and for his role in this, he would receive his final Oscar nomination. In July of 1962, he was admitted to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital, where he was treated for the collapse of a vertebrae, and tragically was found to have cancer of the spine. He was released from hospital in late November of that year, and shortly after this, he fell into a coma. He passed away at his home on December the 15th, 1962, at the age of 63. Like so many of the films that we discuss in this series, Night of the Hunter has gone on to become something of a cult classic. Robert Mitchum's performance is widely recognised as one of the greatest villains in cinema history, and the cinematography and set design are now seen as essential examples of Hollywood expressionist cinema. As we've already heard, it's gone on to inspire a number of directors, including Spike Lee and the Coen brothers, and with its combination of social commentary, fairy tale imagery, and children in peril, it anticipates the work of Guillermo del Toro in films like The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, as well as our second film this week, Tigers Are Not Afraid. It's just a great shame that Charles Laughton, who put his heart and soul into the movie, never got to see its re-evaluation. All of which brings us on to our second film this week, which is Tigers Are Not Afraid from 2017. Starring Paolo Lara, Juan Ramon Lopez, Hansel Casillas and Rodrigo Cortez, it was directed and written by Issa Lopez. So normally, at this stage in the episode, I give a spoiler warning and advise listeners who haven't seen the movie to approach with caution. However, today, instead, I am going to strongly recommend that if you haven't seen the movie yet, please press pause, go and watch it, and then come back. It is an incredibly good film, and quite honestly, the less you know about it, the better. So you'd really be doing yourself a huge favour by going in completely blind. I'm also going to try my best to discuss it while giving away as little as humanly possible, though that is going to be rather difficult with some things, so please do try to watch it before you go any further. Issa Lopez was born in Mexico City in 1971. Very sadly, her mother died when she was just 8 years old, and she and her sister were raised by her father, who was a college professor. Experiencing such a loss at a young age inevitably leaves a mark, and she went on to say in a later interview, quote, "When that happens, you start looking for and questioning what you see around you, and wondering if this is it, if this is all, that what we see is all of it, or if there's more, and if there's stuff that is not as evident and only manifests in certain circumstances. And so you start falling in love with ghost stories, because they point to the fact that death is not an end." End quote. This questioning and metaphysical exploration led her not just towards the ghost story, but also down the roads of science fiction and fantasy, creating a love for genre that was deepened by the folklore and superstitions of her homeland. As her father had to work, she and her sister were often cared for by nannies, who came from small towns that circled the city, and who brought with them folktales and legends that would not only fire her young imagination, but would also inspire the screenplay for Tigers. As academia was not necessarily the best paid job, she has recalled life being tough, but her father would do all that he could to keep the children entertained, taking them on road trips every weekend, visiting small towns, and, quote, watching kung fu and horror movies in travelling cinemas, end quote. These trips would also include visits to archaeological sites, jungles, deserts, and the most haunted little towns in the country, all of which would have also fed into her growing imagination. In the evenings, he would tell them stories to keep them entertained, one of which was his version of The Monkey's Paw, an Old English story by W. W. Jacobs. Originally published in 1902, this tells of an old couple who are granted 3 wishes, each of which quite naturally comes with a catch. And of course, this story is greatly referenced in Tigers, with the 3 wishes granted Estrella also delivering unintended consequences. This combination of genre fiction, exploration, and folk history led to 2 great passions: a love of archaeology, which she has called the discovery of lost things, and a love of creative writing. Although she won her first short story prize at age 17, she didn't initially pursue writing as a career, and after school enrolled in an archaeology course at the National School of Anthropology and History. She continued in this vein until she was 19, when, in her own words, she had to admit that her fantasy of archaeology was not what real archaeology looked like, and this led her back to what she considers her true calling, the telling of stories. Leaving archaeology behind, she then enrolled in Mexico's National University Film School, obtaining a BA in film directing and screenwriting, which she then followed with a 2-year graduate program for dramatic writing. Her first paid work in the entertainment industry was writing and directing segments for the Mexican version of Sesame Street, but she eventually moved on to write for daily soap operas, or telenovela as they are called in Mexico and South America. Although a highly popular medium, as you can probably imagine, they do not provide the greatest artistic release, but the rapid turnaround times and discipline added a practical level to her education and also allowed her to hone her talents. After several years, she found her way into the Mexican film industry, writing romantic comedies, which again are an incredibly popular genre in Mexico. The first of these, titled Ladies' Night, became the 5th highest grossing Mexican film of 2003 and 2004. This success, quite naturally, led to more screenwriting jobs, all of which were very much in the romantic comedy subgenre. However, she still very much had the urge to direct, an ambition that she says took years for the studios to recognise. Eventually, they relented, and she was able to direct 2 features, both of which she has described as being caustic comedies. Perhaps understandably, success in Mexican TV and film led to a move to the US, where opportunities seemed greater, but this proved to be something of a blind alley. Opportunities were, in reality, still rather thin on the ground, and those that did exist were still very much in the romantic comedy subgenre, a field in which she had no real passion. It was during this period that she says she suffered a trio of life-changing events, the combination of which led to a re-evaluation of her life and work. First came the breakup of a long-term relationship, followed by the tragic loss of her father, and finally, coming hard on the heels of his passing, she had to put her dog to sleep. This combination not only led her to re-evaluate her life, it also pushed her deeper into writing, and she says that the screenplay for Tigers was not so much a creative release as it was a means of survival. The idea for the film took shape when she was researching a different screenplay that would ultimately go unproduced. This was to be a World War II drama about drug trafficking and would focus on a lesser-known wartime story, that of legal opium poppy cultivation in Mexico, an arrangement with the US to meet the military's urgent need for morphine during the war. During this period, Mexican farmers switched from growing food to growing poppies and created an incredibly profitable industry. When the war ended, so did the deal with the US, but the cultivation and the trafficking of course did not disappear, and the supply chain simply pivoted into the illegal drugs trade. And whilst it would be an overstatement and somewhat reductive to say that this gave birth to the cartels of today, it certainly helped lay the groundwork. Understandably, the interviews for this project would often spin into conversations about the modern-day drug cartels and the impact of drug and gang-related crime in Mexico. During these conversations, the subject of disappearances was raised, and particularly what happens to the children that are left behind. We touched on this subject very loosely when we discussed the 2011 movie We Are What We Are back in episode 10, and it's an issue that I have thought long and hard about covering in any depth. It's a sensitive, important, and very current topic, and it's also one that I know very little about, so I really don't want to get it wrong, and I want to make sure I handle it respectfully. I think possibly the most appropriate way that I can address it is to simply read some extracts from a Human Rights Watch report on the country that was issued in 2024, and I'll also list the full article in the show notes. Quote, President Pardo, who took office in October, has inherited a human rights crisis rooted in extreme violence by organised crime groups and widespread abuse by state agents with near total impunity. There are extremely high rates of violent crime, including homicide, in many parts of Mexico. 6 cities registered homicide rates higher than 100 per 100,000 residents in 2022. Nationally, the homicide rate fell slightly for the 3rd year in a row, although the number of reported disappearances has increased. More than 115,000 people were considered missing as of September 2024. Most have gone missing since 2006. Many missing people may have been killed and buried in the nearly 5,700 clandestine graves that activists and authorities have uncovered. Around 53,000 human remains were in storage, awaiting identification as of the close of 2022. Other missing people may have been marked as unidentified and buried in municipal graves by authorities. In September, journalists found that more than 72,000 human remains had been labelled as unidentified by state morgues from 2006 to 2023. In 2022, around 15,000 human remains processed by morgues were not identified. End quote. As I mentioned, the full article will be linked in the show notes, and it makes for incredibly sobering reading. This then is the landscape that informs the movie. In the director's own words, the children left behind by the disappearances become the perfect victims, left on their own and preyed upon by the cartels to become child soldiers, prostitutes, and, quite horrifically, possibly trafficked for their organs. Lopez says that this discussion stopped her in her tracks and made her question why she had never really thought of this perspective. She is particularly critical of the vast amount of entertainment shows that use drug cartels as a narrative conceit and that are essentially glorifying death and making icons out of killers. In her words, quote, "These shows portray men who come from nothing and through violence become kings of the world, but nobody is talking about the impact on the children that are left behind." End quote. Even then, it took her a while to find a narrative that would support the theme, until one day she remembered a half-written short story that she had started as a teenager. This was a story about a little boy who wants to belong to a gang of other children who don't want to let him join. And this, combined with the real-life horrors of the Mexican drug trade and her love of genre and magical realism, became the basis for the screenplay. The script was written in stolen moments that she carved out for herself while continuing to write romantic comedies. Forcing herself to wake up an hour earlier every morning, she committed to writing a scene a day, refusing to get out of bed until that scene was finished, whether it was half a page or 9. This approach not only meant that the first draft was completed within 2 months, but it also had an interesting side effect. Waking up with the alarm and writing in her laptop before she was fully awake infused the screenplay with what she later described as a dream narrative, and this ultimately found its way into the finished film. Lopez has freely admitted that there is, without question, an element of autobiography in the film's narrative of a young girl losing her mother. After a brief introduction to the character of Shelley, the movie opens proper with our central character Estrella, who acts very much as the eyes of the audience and is the conduit through which we will experience the world of the film. Estrella comes home from school one day to find her mother gone, one of the disappeared who has been taken without explanation or reason. Estrella's school, where she has been learning about fairy tales, has now been closed due to gang violence, and so she is left completely alone and without any support system at all. In interviews, the director has pointed out that this is in fact the reality for many young children. Their mothers are often barely out of childhood themselves, and family networks are often non-existent. Left to fend for herself, Estrella attempts to join the only people she thinks can help her, a small group of equally deserted children who live on the rooftops and who are led by Shelley. But whilst this structure would sit equally comfortably in a socio-realist drama, Lopez infuses it with myth and magic, drawing on the folk tales and heritage of her homeland while reflecting the youth, innocence and imagination of her child protagonists. And, as with most good ghost stories, the supernatural here is also metaphorical, allowing for an exploration of themes that might otherwise feel a little too on the nose. As the movie opens, a tiger that has been graffitied onto a wall by Shine comes to animated life, escaping from its painted cage and introducing a recurrent theme of freedom and escape, one that is later echoed by the goldfish that have escaped their tank in the abandoned hotel. Just a few moments later, Estrella is given 3 slips of paper to represent 3 wishes, a gift from her teacher, doubtless offered as a distraction, while gunfire blasts outside of the classroom. But to Estrella, these wishes are real, opening the narrative to the possibilities of magical thinking and wish fulfillment that also run throughout the movie. And as she walks home from school and past a dead body, we see her followed by a trail of blood, a metaphor not only for the spirits that will appear as the story progresses, but also for the impact of death and violence, a visual reminder that once witnessed, the aftermath will always stay with you, no matter how far you try to run. Considering the film's opening image, and indeed its English language title, the introduction of the tiger was a surprisingly late addition to the process. Although the story is set in a city, the location feels more like a ghost town. The children wander through deserted streets, encountering few people beyond rival gangs, drug lords, and towards the end, a pair of distinctly unhelpful policemen. This desolation serves again as a metaphor for the devastation wrought by Mexico's drug wars, which have turned once vibrant communities into lifeless ruins. In preparing the film's look and feel, Lopez was struck by a photograph that would become a key visual reference in shaping the film's atmosphere, and this was a picture of a deer in an abandoned cathedral. The image struck her as both haunting and also a reminder of Terry Gilliam's 1995 movie 12 Monkeys, which is another film that she has identified as a reference point. The idea of a wild animal roaming free in a city in Mexico might seem somewhat bizarre, but it does in fact have a grounding in reality. Some Mexican drug lords did indeed establish private zoos, and when the authorities moved in, they didn't always know what to do with them. And this then led the director to ask, what if, in a city abandoned by its people, one of the drug lords is killed and their animals are set loose? Originally, the plan was not for a tiger or a deer, but a zebra, which was intended to appear later in the film when Shine is spraying some graffiti. The zebra would stare at him and then walk away, a moment of magic amongst the dark reality. However, rather serendipitously, there were actually no zebras available in Mexico at the time, and a hippo was offered instead, which quite clearly wouldn't have had exactly the same effect. But when one of the team advised that a tiger was also a possibility, it was not only included in the film, but became central to the film's narrative. As this research into photographs would indicate, Lopez undertook an extensive period of preparation for the movie, creating mood boards of images and lining the walls of her office with notes. All of this, of course, greatly informed the work of cinematographer Juan Jose Saravia, who was on board with the project from the very beginning. Wanting to create a strong aesthetic while avoiding what he has called misery porn, the look of the film was informed by still photography and photojournalism, largely from the Magnum Cooperative. However, the dreamlike and fairy tale subtext also allows for the introduction of the strange and the whimsical. The toy tiger that guides Estrella in the later stages of the movie is but one example, suggesting an almost Pokemon-like evolution from graffitied image to living toy and then to the final tiger of the climax. There is also the pool filled with goldfish in the abandoned hotel, and the unexplained burning piano that illuminates the scene in which we are introduced to the rival gang led by Brian. The scenes with the ghosts are also well handled, multiplying in number as they appear across the film, and providing genuine moments of unease despite their supposed benevolence. wrapped in sheets of plastic as their bodies decompose. These are the victims of violence, and as the film implies, they are legion, and they are everywhere. Much like The Night of the Hunter, the visuals here are also shaped by the fact that the story unfolds through the eyes of children. This gave rise to the idea that the camera, and by extension the viewer, should essentially become another member of the gang, leading to the use of handheld and steadicam shots, often framed at child's eye level. This approach is further underlined by moments when the view is partially obstructed by objects in the foreground, as though the camera itself is hiding among the children. Some reviewers took issue with this approach, but I have to say, for me, it works really well. And maintaining the children's point of view also raises one of the film's central ambiguities, whether the magic experienced by Estrella is truly real or merely a product of her imagination. Lopez has said that she leaves that choice to the audience, though she herself believes it to be real, and personally, I like to agree with her, though I think the film retains all of its power, regardless of which side you fall on. The film's dark and troubling themes are balanced by moments of humour and levity that arise naturally from its child-centred perspective, and that also act as a welcome pressure valve for the film's more oppressive undertones. These lighter interludes appear both in the dialogue, such as when the children argue about whether people practice black magic virtuals, and in their moments of play, where they tell each other stories by torchlight or play an animated game of football inside the hotel. My favourite moment is the recreation of a TV talent contest, which delivers more than a few smiles and creates pockets of innocence and joy. And of course, these moments of levity also serve as a stark contrast to the inevitable tragedies, meaning that they hit all the more brutally when they finally arrive. The casting process for the young leads was, as you can imagine, nothing if not thorough, and over 600 children were seen by the casting team. It was incredibly important for Lopez that they cast actors who could give genuine and realistic performances, and whose acting choices would not be coloured or informed by the slightly melodramatic acting style popularised by the telenovela. To ensure this, as well as helping with the final stages of casting, she employed the talents of an acting coach called Fatima Toledo. Fatima Toledo has been described as the first acting coach in Brazilian cinema, and this was a role that she effectively invented when she started working on the 1981 Brazilian crime drama Pixote, a story which follows a 10-year-old street boy as he navigates a brutal world of reform school. Much like Tigers, it centred on young children trying to survive a violent society, and the performers were, on the whole, largely unknown street children at the time. Toledo was invited onto the set by the director Hector Babenco after he had seen her working with children at a state youth facility. And it was on this set that she first started to develop her method. She realised that the classic acting techniques that are trained to adults wouldn't necessarily work with children, and started to adopt a trust-first and emotion-led approach that she would later refine over the years. Although her work certainly achieved the required results, and the film has subsequently been voted one of the greatest Brazilian movies of all time, the idea of an acting coach was not recognised in Brazilian cinema, and she ended up leaving the industry and working for 10 years in a local bank. She would not return to film until 1991, when she was invited again by Babenco to coach the cast of At Play in the Fields of the Lord, only now they were Hollywood big hitters, including John Lithgow, Daryl Hannah, Tom Waits, Kathy Bates, and Tom Berenger. Following this, she started working full-time as an acting coach and casting director, and is perhaps most famous for her work on the 2001 movie City of God. Much like Pixote, here she worked again with unknown child performers, many of whom were residents of the favelas depicted in the film. And this experience gave rise to an incredibly sad and tragic observation, as she commented on the contrast between the young cast of her first movie and the cast of this one, saying, quote, "When I did Pixote, I saw those children as if they still had a chance. They still dreamed. 21 years later, when I did City of God, they no longer believed they had a chance." End quote. She has described her method as one of building trust and psychological safety first, and then helping the actor to unlock and experience genuine emotion, emphasizing lived and real reactions to achieve performances that don't feel like acting. Of her work on Tigers, Lopez has described a month-long workshop process with the young cast, saying, quote, "For the first 2 weeks, I worked directly with Fatima Toledo because I love the acting style in City of God. She basically cleaned the kids of acting devices so they could connect with real feelings. Her method involves stripping away a lot of the thought process and the reasoning behind the story and getting down to the raw emotions, which really works with children. For the second week, she basically cleaned the children of their preconceptions about acting, and then it was my time to find the tools to keep the children getting to those emotional places." End quote. And the tool that Toledo gave the director was the advice that if she wanted the children to go to a place of emotion, whether it was fear, anger, or sorrow, Lopez had to go there first, to feel the emotion herself and role model what was required from her young performers. As Lopez herself has said, this goes against most of the rules of film directing and is a far cry from the approach taken by many other directors, but I think it's fair to say that this technique worked brilliantly. The young cast give incredibly realistic and convincing performances, acting that indeed does not feel like acting, and that contains an emotional truth that is quite often missing from child performers, and also more than a few adults. Paolo Lara, who played Estrella, reflected on the experience as being incredibly hard because she had to work with emotions, but that it was through this process that she learned that true acting is not just saying the lines, but it's feeling them. And although the cast are all equally impressive, it has to be said that the film does belong to both Lara as Estrella and Juan Ramon Lopez as Shine, characters who are essentially two sides of the same coin and two halves of the one whole. Both of them give outstanding performances, and I'm very happy to see that their careers have continued in these subsequent years. Tigers Are Not Afraid had its world premiere at Fantastic Fest in Austin, Texas on the 24th of September 2017. It immediately drew admiration for its juxtaposition of social realism and dreamlike narrative. Perhaps inevitably, it was compared to the works of fellow Mexican director Guillermo del Toro, most notably Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone, which is certainly a fine compliment. Critics also praised the film's painterly compositions and the extraordinary performances given by the young cast, describing it as, quote, a stunning masterpiece of terror and beauty. The film continued to play the international festival circuit and then had a limited release in US cinemas before streaming on Shudder in late 2019, where it once again attracted widespread acclaim. Overall, it was hailed as a remarkable achievement and established Lopez as one of the most distinctive voices in contemporary Mexican cinema. The success of the movie led to Lopez being selected as the showrunner for Season 4 of the series True Detective, with her installment, subtitled Night Country, released in early 2024. It was nominated for 19 Primetime Emmy Awards and in fact became the most nominated season out of all 4 series. Jodie Foster won an Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actress and would also win Best Actress at the 82nd Golden Globe Awards, where the show also received nominations, including Best Limited or Anthology Series. Following this success, it was announced that she would continue as the showrunner, and pre-production on the upcoming 5th season is, I believe, currently underway. According to IMDb, she is also working on an untitled werewolf western project, though whether this will manifest and what shape it will take is yet to be established. The Night of the Hunter and Tigers Are Not Afraid clearly have a great deal in common. Both are set against the backdrop of very real horrors, the first against the poverty and desperation of the 1930s depression, and the other under the shadow of Mexico's drug cartels. Both stories follow children who embark on escapes from persecution and frame their narratives with fairy tale imagery that mirrors the innocence and imagination of their young protagonists. But while Charles Laughton's masterpiece closes on a note of redemption, with the villain vanquished and family life restored, Lopez offers a far bleaker and perhaps more honest conclusion. Some of the children that we come to love across her movie do not survive to the end, and even those who do are left facing a world where safety is uncertain and fleeting. The final image of Estrella walking through a field of flowers may promise escape and hope, but it is a hope that is steeped in melancholy. After all, she walks there all alone. As Lopez herself has observed, in today's world, children too often become the perfect victims. And this is a harsh truth that extends far beyond the streets of Mexico City, and one that we would do well never to forget. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have any thoughts or comments on either of this week's films, or indeed any of the films that we've discussed in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow me on Instagram at thehorrordouble. And after our haunted house excursions a couple of weeks ago, next week we are back with 2 more ghost stories, though this time with more of an international flavour. First up, we have A Tale of Two Sisters from 2003 and South Korea, directed by Kim Ji-woon and starring Im Soo-young, Moon Gu-young and Yum Young-ah. And then we head back to Spain for The Orphanage from 2007 from director J.A. Bayona, starring Belen Ruda, Fernando Coelho and Roger Princep. So if you want to watch along and you're in the UK, A Tale of Two Sisters is currently available to watch on Apple TV, Shudder, Prime Video and the Arrow Player, while The Orphanage is available for rent or purchase from Apple TV, the Sky Store and also Amazon Prime. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you once again for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.